This is going to be a fun one. So we're going to be taking a look at AMD's latest Strix Point processor on two of the latest Asus laptops available. Thank you very much to Asus for letting me borrow these. It's actually going to sting a little bit when I have to return these because these are super, super nice. Insofar as simpler laptop, Ultrabook type of MacBook laptops, these things are pretty killer. We're going to go through a bunch of that. And of course, the day that I'm planning on editing all my video, Asus pushes out an update for these laptops, version 308, which does change some of the game benchmarks that I was going to show, specifically with Cyberpunk, like I'm demoing here. There is significant performance improvements on Cyberpunk. However, it's still pretty bad, especially when we compare it to like Hawkpoint, the 8840U, which I'll show you in just a moment in the game benches part of this section. The Zenbook S16 effectively comes in two different variants. The two different variants only differ insofar as the type of Strix Point processor that's there and the amount of RAM that is installed on them. On the AMD Ryzen AI9 365 version, that is the version that only comes with 24 gigs of system RAM. And then everything else is pretty much the same to the higher spec model, which is the Ryzen AI9 HX 3070. The Ryzen AI9 HX 3070, the big claim to fame there is that it has a much bigger GPU. It actually has 4 more compute units. So it has 16 CUs that can be driven at 2.9 gigahertz. Now, that is really nice insofar as taking a look at gaming and pushing more performance at lower TDPs. It actually does a better job. Pushing more power into it really doesn't make that much of a difference. We're just too memory bound on pretty much every game that we're going to be testing. Pushing more power into it doesn't really do much for you. The big standout feature here is that 16-inch 3K OLED touchscreen display. Asus has been knocking these displays out of the park. This is a 16-inch display, which is really my preferred size for a standard laptop. I feel like that is the best balance of all worlds. Like 17 inch is a bit too large, 15 inch is a bit too small. 16 inch is really a sweet spot for me, so I'm glad that they really started hammering home on this. The resolution is what they call 3K, so it's 2880 by 1800. However, it is 120 hertz and still features VRR. So it does have variable refresh rate. That is awesome to have a killer panel. Also, it doesn't use all that much power, which we're going to get to a little bit in the battery test a little bit later, just so you can see how good they do. All the battery tests I do are at 50% brightness, so we'll give you a good idea of what to expect there. When diving into the inside of the laptop, the first thing you should say is, holy moly, that battery is gigantic. And it is. It's a big battery. It's an 80 watt-hour battery, which is fantastic on a device like this that is absolutely outrageously thin. When thinking of Ultrabooks, Asus has taken this to the next level, and really, it's when comparing this to what you would anticipate for a MacBook competitor, this is checking a lot of boxes. Unfortunately, we only have one 2280 NVMe SSD slot in here, so there isn't much room for expandability. However, it's 1 terabyte on both models. Looking at the RAM on here, you can indeed see that it is soldered, so there is no upgrading RAM on here. All of the RAM is going to be what you get. So if you get the AI 365 AMD version, that's only going to have 24 gigs of RAM. Going up to HX 3070 does offer 32 gigs of RAM, and honestly, if you're taking a look at this and thinking with those 50 tops from the XNDNE part of the Ryzen Strix part of this, you may want to mess around with AI stuff. You're going to need more RAM. That's just something that you're going to need. Now, the difference between 24 and 32 isn't a ginormous amount, but it may be the difference between some models that you're able to actually use or not. Going along the sides, we do have an HDMI 2.1 slot, and this will allow you to export to 4K VRR as well. We do have 2 full USB-C 4 slots, a 3.5mm audio jack, and then on the other side, we have a standard USB-A, USB 3.2 slot, as well as a full-size SD card slot. Please note that this is half insertion width, so if you were to put an SD card, half of an SD card will be sticking out of this. It will not be able to go fully into the laptop. It'll be sticking out some. So if that annoys you, just be mindful that it isn't meant for full-time extra storage. It's only meant for actually removable storage. One other thing that I love about this is that the PCB is so crammed that where they stuck the Wi-Fi, it's at like an angle just so that you can get it on the PCB itself. This is a Wi-Fi 7 part as well. So what we're seeing here really is all the bells and whistles that you can possibly expect to get out of the latest and greatest laptop, and it is available in something that is a fairly decent MacBook competitor. On the business end of the device, where it comes to the keyboard and the trackpad is ginormously large, much like how MacBook trackpads are ginormously large. I'm actually a big fan of it, plus all the gestures that they support on the trackpad itself through their own software is a nice feature, but I just like having a ginormous touchpad that works reasonably well. The keyboard itself, I don't personally mind. Typing on it wasn't that big of a deal. It is a chocolate island chiclet type of keyboard design. Arrangement-wise, it could be a bit better. I'm not a big fan of where they have the power button. It's not actually at the top right. It's to the left of the delete key. The delete key is actually at the top right, which is fine. I've actually reorganized my brain and how I interface with it. It's not that big of a deal, but the arrow keys could have been a little bit better instead of how they were designed. One other thing that I forgot to mention, the other difference that does need to be mentioned is that on the more expensive HX3070 model, they give you a much nicer power brick, a very super slim 65-watt USB-C charger. This is much, much more travel-friendly compared to the less expensive model. They give you a fat, like, brick that's not as big, but I mean, it's basically twice the size as the charger that you get on the HX3070. So that is one of the other differences that happens on these particular laptops, so just be mindful of that. And the last thing that I want to talk about is the lid that Asus is doing on this. There's a process, this electrochemical process that Asus does. They call it Ceraluminum. It's still aluminum, but the type of coating that happens on there, it has a smudge resistance. It has a high durability. It's supposed to resist a bunch of scratches and nicks and stuff. So it offers a lot of hardening on the aluminum side of things, even though it's still technically aluminum. So even though they're saying Ceraluminum, there is no thermal properties that are different. Its thermal properties are that of aluminum. It's really just about hardness, smudge resistance, and that's pretty much it. It looks super cool. I'm a big fan of it. I actually like the darker model a little bit better as opposed to the lighter model, but I thought I would just mention that as well. Now let's get into battery life test. And this is probably one of the things that a lot of MacBook people that are comparing these laptops to MacBooks, because MacBooks get excellent battery life and standby life. Let's first start at standby time that you can expect to get out of these laptops. Now, when testing both of these over a 24-hour period, effectively I lost 10 watts, 10 watt hours of capacity out of the battery. I had basically went from 100% battery down to 90% battery, and you can see that it woke up a few times during its sleep schedule in that 24-hour period and eventually went down further. Basically, what I would say is anticipate about 10 watt hours of usage in a 24-hour span. Basically, what that means is that, generally speaking, you're going to be looking at 8 days of standby life on this laptop, which isn't fantastic, especially because after 5 days, you're going to be at 50% battery life and you're going to need to charge at that point. So effectively, I really wouldn't use standby time on this at all. The best bet is obviously just to still use Hibernate on Windows laptops, because that's going to be the best bet here. Yeah, there's going to be a startup time and you won't get the standby-like qualities, but you're also not going to get, you're not going to wake up to surprises. Going right along from standby test, we're going to be taking a look at battery life test. And how I like to present this is in a best case and a worst case scenario. This graph that you're taking a look at, we're going to be separating it from a red and blue line. The red represents the Ryzen 9 AI 365, and the blue line represents the Ryzen 9 AI HX 3070. We're looking at the battery charge rate over time. If you take a look at the bottom, this is over 15 hours. We're looking at 15 hours of battery life, and this is H.264 playback. Now, playing back a video isn't that big of a deal because we're going to disengage the CPU and GPU and just be on the decoder. But there is something that needs to be said here, is that we're using exceedingly little power here. Effectively, we're at 2.5 watts on package power, which is fantastic to only be shutting down everything else and just using the decoder. That means that a lot of the power gating functions on this chip are doing a really good job. And when we take a look at the total system power, if you take a look at the graph, you can see that we're only using 5.2 to 5.5 watts of total system power, meaning that we're only using effectively 2.5 watts or 3 watts for the display at 50% brightness, the Wi-Fi going, the SSD, and the fans. Well, the fans probably aren't running with how little power this thing is using, but that is the total system power. So that's a really good showing from here, and a best case scenario of 15 hours of actual usage in video playback. Likewise, on the worst case scenario, let's push this thing as hard as we can, 33 watts, and eventually as we get down to like 20% battery, it'll disengage itself and go into like a whisper mode at the last bits, and we're going to see what that looks like. In this one, I hope you're paying attention. The red line is the Ryzen 9 AI HX 3070, and the blue line is the Ryzen 9 AI 365. And we'll take a look at the charge level over this time. We're looking at basically 1.5 hours of battery life running at 33 watts until it disengages and goes into its whisper mode. And if we take a look at how much power is being used, if you take a look at that envelope, right? At 33 watts that's being used, we're going up to 50 watts of total system power with the display still at 50% brightness. So this is using a significant amount of power. However, with that 80 watt hour battery, we're able to still extract about an hour and a half of battery life. So when we take a look at this, when we say, okay, the best case battery life that you're going to get is around 15 hours, and the worst case battery life that you're going to get is around 1.5 hours, this is the realistic battery range that you should anticipate for this particular series of laptops. They're effectively similar in that regard with a few differences. But when we think about the average use case, you should be getting around 7 to 10 hours of battery life, with general use, I would think, is a normal amount of battery life that you should expect generally on this particular laptop, which I think is a good amount of battery life. Not great or fantastic, just good. So now here's the thing. What we're looking at right now is the thermal camera looking at these laptops running at 33 watts. I don't personally recommend running these devices at 33 watts. There isn't a lot of gain to be had out of running them at 33 watt unless you're going to be plugged in and it's not on your lap. These devices get really hot with how thin they are at 33 watts. It's on the bottom of the panel. It gets reasonably hot towards the back upper end of the device, and it gets sensationally hot at the top upper end above the keyboard. That part gets alarmingly hot when you're pushing this to 33 watts. So just be mindful that if you're going to be running this in its full performance mode, that even with the fans going and everything, that you're still going to have a pretty crispy device at these two particular ranges in those two areas. Everything outside of that is fine. I just wouldn't put it on your lap and just be careful where you're touching. I would say use this for, if you're going to have your laptop hooked up externally, fine, go ahead and put it on 33 watts and you have a keyboard and mouse that you're using external to this. But if you're going to be using this as a laptop, putting it on your lap, actually using it, I would really recommend just staying within standard. There really isn't that much of a reason to go above that unless you're like video editing. But then again, at that point, you should be doing with an external keyboard and mouse and monitor at that point in time. That's just my own personal advice of how to run this device, how to run this laptop if you were going to do so. For CPU benchmarks, let's first take a look at our Cinebench scores. On Cinebench 2024, our Ryzen 9 365, our multi-core score is 700 points, and our single-core score is 113 points. At 113 points, this is fairly respectable. We're a bit behind on multi-core compared to Apple's M3, but on single-core, we're neck and neck. And for single-threaded results, this is often a thing that we care about greatly. Moving over to the HX 3070, our multi-core score gets a significant improvement. We're getting 957 points on our multi-core score, still below what is on the Apple M3. However, our single-core is still pretty good at 111 points. This is slightly behind, ever so slightly behind the 365 and the Apple M3 as well, but still fantastic results both on multi-core and single-core. So this is a device that if you actually wanted to do some video editing on, this is actually a really decent device to be working on your laptop. And finishing off our CPU benches with Geekbench 6, we're taking a look at the Ryzen AI 365. Our single-core score is 2838. Our multi-core score is 12734. And moving over to the HX 3070, once again, even from the Cinebench side, we're getting slightly worse single-threaded scores. We're getting 2787 on single core and 13,336 on multi-core score, which is only slightly better than what we're seeing on the 365. This is a result from Geekbench 6, so take that for what it's worth. That's a look from the CPU benchmark side. Next up, let's take a look at some game benchmarks. We're going to be taking a look at 4 different game benches. Now, before we get into this, like I had mentioned early on in this video, there was a BIOS update that actually improved Cyberpunk results a bit. However, Cyberpunk results are still not great. It still is a bit of a stuttery mess, even with the upgraded BIOS. When we take a look at the difference here on the screen with me pointing at everything, there is a sizable bump going from BIOS version 307 to 308. This is only present in Cyberpunk. It wasn't present in any other game that I tested when matching for TDP. So Cyberpunk was the only game inside of the test that I was doing where I saw this result difference. Metro Exodus did not see any difference, likewise for Batman or Returnal. So Cyberpunk was exclusive with the only part that I saw getting a performance uplift. So that's the only thing I wanted to mention really quick. Outside of that, before we get into this, I will show some brief scores on Cyberpunk alone for comparing it to the Hawkpoint, the 8840U. And I want to not do that right now because I'm only comparing the 365 to the 370. I will have an updated video where I'm taking a look at AMD RDNA 3 and RDNA 3.5 because I have gone ahead and managed to statically clock the GPU on the 880M and 890M. So this way we can actually have a clock for clock difference between RDNA 3 and RDNA 3.5. So that'll be a very interesting video, one that I'm very passionate about and eager to look at and see the results. So I'm looking forward to that video. Stay tuned for that one. For right now, let's go ahead and compare the Ryzen 9 AI 365 versus the Ryzen 9 AI HX 3070 between these two laptops. First game that we're going to be taking a look at, comparing both of these laptops. Again, the parts that we're taking a look at here is the Ryzen AI 9 HX3070, which is a 16 CU which has the AMD 890M, the bigger, better iGPU on there. And the other laptop has the Ryzen AI 9 365. It doesn't have HX in the name. And that is the 880M, and it's something closer to what the 7840U and the 8840U have, Phoenix or Hawk Point variants have as well, except this is RDNA 3.5. There will be a video later on, another video separately, where we'll be comparing both of those. And again, like I said earlier on in this video, I have found a way to lock clocks on Strix Point, so we'll be able to get a more one-to-one comparison at those same clocks and see what type of power they're consuming, as well as what kind of performance they get. And what's great is they basically have the same memory constraints, so we're actually going to be able to get a really good understanding of how much better RDNA 3.5 is. This particular game that we're looking at is Batman Arkham Knight 720p max settings with no NVIDIA GameWorks. Up first, we're going to be taking a look at the 12-watt TDP slice, which is right here. This is what Asus has in their power profiles called Whisper Mode. When you engage this, it'll go to 12 watt. After some time, there is different PL1 and PL2 values, but once you lock it in, these are the results that you're going to get. So we're looking at 56 FPS average on the 365 or the 880M model, and we're getting around 65 FPS average on the 370 or the 890M. Percentages wise, this basically means we have a 16% increase on averages and a 13% increase on 1 percentile frames. This is pretty good, and what we're really should be seeing with that increased core count on the 890M. The reason being is because when we focus on lower clocks, we should be able to have better power constraints given that. And this is a video that I talked about at length prior, but it's just what we're seeing manifest happening right now in front of us. When we take a look at our next set at 17 watt, this is the standard power config on Asus, and we're looking at 93 FPS average on the 3070 or the 890M model, and we're looking at 82 FPS average on the 365. If we take a look at percentages, we're looking at 13% better on averages and 13% better on our 1 percentile. Now, as we push power onto this, I could not, for whatever reason, when you put full power, this is, part of the problem that Asus is just flooding the SMU. So even though I can set a TDP, it immediately gets overwritten by Asus's own software. So I could only do a 28 watt TDP test on the 365 variant, but even with 5 watts less, when we're pushing a bunch of power into it, you're really not going to see any real improvement. We just don't have the bandwidth to satisfy that power. It just doesn't matter. You can push as much power into this, you're not really going to see that much of an improvement. The biggest improvement, especially as we start gaining higher FPS, is going to become more CPU bound, and we're not going to really have a GPU problem, we're going to have a CPU problem. So we're looking at 108 FPS average for the 3070 at 33 watts, and we're looking at 102 FPS average at 28 watt on the 365. Effectively, they're not big of a difference. It's a 6% difference, even though we have 5 more watts going into the 3070. Again, no real big difference or anything to write home about. When we take a look at our 1 percentile, it's 4% difference. Again, this is what you should expect, pushing more power into this just because it's a much bigger GPU. If you don't have the memory bandwidth to back it up, it's not going to do a whole bunch for you. So this is pretty much what we're looking at. The next game we're going to be taking a look at is Cyberpunk 2077. This is running 720p with the Steam Deck preset. However, I have taken away upscaling, which is a default that gets set on the Steam Deck preset. So I went ahead and removed that, so I'm running 720p native here. If you're going to try to match my settings, make sure that you go ahead and remove that, or otherwise you're going to get wildly different results. If we take a look at our 12 watt TDP slice, you should automatically start seeing something is pretty wrong here. And we're going to compare briefly here what an 8840U part looks like at different wattages, just so you can see how bad these 1 percentile and 0.1 percentile actually are. There's a lot of stuttering going on. For Cyberpunk alone, we don't see this in other games so far that I've tested, but Cyberpunk is a kind of a good indicator where the CPU side of things is looking kind of hairy. Now, I will test this again later on in another video where I'm doing GPU tests, where I'll try to park those cores and see if I can get better results here, but this is kind of a default configuration that I think is going to apply to most people currently at the moment. Now again, this is the latest version 308 BIOS that is on both of these laptops, and the results are actually better. If you take a look at the previous results, they're even worse on BIOS 307. So 308 improves things considerably on Cyberpunk, even though it's still quite stuttery. In 12 watt, we can see that the 365 is a little bit ahead. On averages, we're looking at 28 FPS average and 27 FPS average on the better model. At our 1 percentile, we're getting slightly better results on the 3070, but overall, this is still a very, very poor showing. At 17 watt, the 365 is much better than the 3070. We're getting around 42 FPS average versus 41 FPS average. However, if we take a look at our 1 percentile, this is pretty bad. So on the 3070, we're getting 13 FPS on our 1 percentile, and we're getting 21 FPS on our 1 percentile on the 365. This still isn't great. In fact, let me go ahead and bring in an 8840U at 15 watt. This is the GPD Win Mini result here. Okay, so just so you can see, this is 15 watt right here. Okay, you can see the 1 percentile and 0.1 percentile, and you can clearly see how bad the stuttering is in this picture right here. At least in here, we're getting 30 FPS on our 1 percentile, so you can at least have a 30 FPS experience in 15 watt TDP on the 8840 at Hawk Point. But if we take a look at 365, it's even worse than 8840. So we have a real problem with Cyberpunk, even on the latest BIOS, with how the game is currently right now versus the older AMD parts, like on the 8840U. So I'll go ahead and remove that now. And again, we'll go up to 33 watts on the HX 3070, which you can see right here is getting 54.2 FPS average. And the 365 at 28 watts is getting 63 FPS average. Now, again, pushing more power into these systems past 23 watt, there's going to be massive diminishing returns, just absolutely massive. The more we're pushing into that clock, the worse we're actually going to get. Also, again, huge memory bottleneck here. So just pushing more power, it doesn't matter. The only benefit you're going to see is whatever benefit RDNA 3.5 offers over RDNA 3, which there does appear to be quite a number of improvements. I'll have another video following up on this, like I've already discussed earlier, where we're going to do clock for clock so we can get a better understanding of what is the actual improvements on RDNA 3.5. But for now, we're doing default settings, and we can see that even at 33 watt, our 1 percentile is 23.6 FPS. However, on the 365, the lesser part, is getting 35.4 FPS on our 1 percentile. Let's bring in the 8840U. This is the GPD Win Mini running at 20 watt. I want you to just kind of understand what's going on here. So at 20 watt TDP, again, after 20 watt TDP, there's going to be massive diminishing returns anyway, but you can see how much of a more smoother experience this is. We have 8 less watts than the 365 and 13 less watts than the 3070. However, our 1 percentile frames is almost 40 FPS average, 40 FPS generally speaking on our 1 percentile. So this is going to offer a far smoother experience at 20 watt on the 8840U compared to these other models. So either Cyberpunk's going to have to get updated, there's going to have to be further BIOS revisions to make Cyberpunk better on this, or we're going to have to start parking some cores. There's going to be some things that we might have to do, or there's just things that have to be done software-wise to fix this. That's neither here nor there, so that's just the results. I'll go ahead and remove the 20 watt just so you have a better idea and have an overall look at what this looks like. The next game we're looking at is Metro Exodus. This is 720p and high settings. Now, the reason I love looking at Metro Exodus is the 4A engine is really hard on GPUs, especially the high setting. This is going to clobber a lot of GPUs, and on mobile parts, we are wanting a bunch on the GPU side. So if we take a look at the 12 watt TDP slice here, this is again the Whisper mode on the Asus models. We're going to see that we have a 20 FPS average on the 3070 and a 17 FPS average on the 365. So around a 20% performance boost. However, our 1 percentile is a lot better. We're basically 2 times better. Now, again, this is only 8.6 on our 1 percentile, so this is a not playable experience at all with these particular settings. But the reason I'm putting on this is because we're really trying to stress the GPU portion of this to understand how much better the GPU is, where the CPU is really not going to be engaged at all. It's going to be sitting around doing nothing, and the GPU is really going to be driving a lot of the frame rate increase that we get here. Going up to 17 watt, you can see that I have a slight variation here because on the 3070 model, try as I might, I could not get it to stick to 17 watt. It was fluctuating at 20 watt for the longest time in standard mode. Eventually, it simmered down to about 18 watt. Eventually, that's all I could get. It would not really stick to 17 watt like the 365 did. When we take a look at the differences here, we're looking at 27.4 FPS average on the 365 and 37.5 FPS average on the 3070. Now, this is a ginormous increase, and this is largely where we're going to see that the 3070 model at 17 watt, 18 watt is its peak power efficiency. As we push more power into it, we're not going to get any of those gains because, again, we are so memory bound. We're not actually being able to do anything with that extra power. So at 18 watt, we're really seeing the full force of the GPU being fully utilized, and we're getting that huge bump. Basically, what you're seeing here is you may be asking, well, if there's more GPU, shouldn't that cost more power? The answer is no, because when we have more CUs, we can actually use less clock frequency inside of that, thus using less power, but still we can use less power on the GPU side, but get more performance out of it, okay? the voltage required for lesser clocks isn't as much when you take a look at how it scales. So just be mindful of that we have to push clocks harder on the 365 because we only have 12 CPUs. If we have to push clocks harder, that means that it takes more power, thus we're not going to get that much performance. And that's why you see such a large difference here on the 3070. In our 1 percentile, we're looking at 16.9 FPS average and 14.1 FPS average on the 365. So this is a really good showing from the 3070 from the GPU end. However, when we go straight into the higher TDP segment, this may surprise some of you, but if you've been following my channel for a while, this is not going to surprise any of you because this is what I've been saying for a long time now. When we take a look at this, again, the 365, we're at 28 watt here, and the 3070, I'm at 33 watt. I have pushing 5 more watts into the package, and yet the averages are basically the same. We have 1.5% better, but effectively they're both 39 FPS average. And we take a look at our 1 percentile. We're actually getting slightly better on the 365. This is where we're at, right? Like you can just push as much power you want into that GPU, but if we're not able to do anything insofar as this GPU is just sitting around waiting for something to come in. If it can't get fed, nothing's going to happen. So inside of that scope, RDNA 3.5 for both of these guys is not effectively doing anything effective in this particular game. So pushing more power into this doesn't really matter. And again, is one of the reasons why I would really only run this laptop in the standard power configuration. Last game we're going to be looking at is Returnal, and I love looking at this game because it so perfectly encapsulates what we need out of a GPU, and it's so brutal on GPU, in fact, that I actually have to use FSR2 balanced even at 720p. So I'm using a sub-resolution of 720p and then upscaling to 720p and still using low settings. So when we take a look at this at our 12 watt scope, the 3070 is actually doing fairly decent at 12 watt. We're getting almost 30 FPS average versus the 22 FPS average on the 365. And our 1 percentile, we're getting 16.4 FPS on our 1 percentile and 12.8 on our 1 percentile. Percentage-wise, we're doing 30% better between these in 12 watt scope and 30% better on 1 percentile as well. So even both of these locked at 12 watt, the 3070 is about 30% better in its whisper mode. So this is, again, another reason why the 3070 version is clearly better than the 365. Having more GPU cores and running them at lower clocks is a big benefit. Likewise, when we go up and push power into it, now this is interesting because these are kind of divided. The 365 17 watt is down here and the 370 17 watt is up here. The 25 watt for the 365, which I have here, is in between because the 17 watt is just doing so much better on the 3070. And again, 17-18 watt is going to be peak efficiency for the 3070 just because, again, we don't have memory bandwidth and pushing more power into it is not going to really mean all that much. So if we take a look at 17 watt, we're looking 36.6 FPS average on the 365. However, 17 watt is looking at 43.8 FPS average. So that is a 20% increase inside those two 17 watt TDP ceilings. At our 1 percentile on the 365, we're looking at 18.8 FPS. It's not all that great. However, 17 watt on the 3070, we're at 24.1 FPS on our 1 percentile. This is approaching somewhat decent for how much power we're pushing into the system and how demanding the game Returnal actually is. In terms of performance improvement, we're looking at a 30% performance improvement on our 1 percentile. Now, again, trying to get these matched up, it would not go up to 33 watt, even though I tried pushing it. 25 watt was the only stable bench that I can get on 365. So we're looking at 38.2 FPS average versus 50 FPS average on 33 watt on the HX 3070. Likewise, on our 1 percentile, we're looking at the difference between 21.3 on FPS on our 1 percentile for the 365 at 25 watt versus 29 FPS on our 1 percentile on the HX 3070. Now, we're pushing considerably more wattage into this, 8 more watts. So we should, you would think, see a much bigger gain. But again, we are not seeing a larger gain by pushing more power into the platform between these two devices, just because, again, we are memory bandwidth bound. Where this thing sits at its peak efficiency, again, is at 17 watt, and that should be more than evident here, because think about it. Going from 17 watt to 33 watts, right? That's 16 more watts, almost 100% more power we're pushing into the system, and we're only getting 14% better averages. 14%, and our 1 percentile is 20%. We're pushing 100% more power into it, nearly 100% more power into it, and only getting 15% more gains. There is no purpose when playing games with how memory bound we are. There's just no purpose. You can do it if you just really need just 15% more frame rate. If you're plugged in, then who cares? But I would really advise, if you're especially on battery, just keep the device at standard, which is going to be 17 watt generally speaking. It'll fluctuate to like 22, 20 watt, and then kind of simmer down to 17 watt. But really, that is the best wattage for the platform, as evidenced through everything that we've looked at so far. So can I recommend these Ultrabook, MacBook-like PC laptops from Asus? Yeah, these latest AMD Strix Point processors are pretty awesome. I mean, when you look at these laptops, they're outrageously thin, super thin, like the ports for the USB-C ports are basically the width of the laptop itself. And yet we still have 80 watt-hour batteries on these things with a super nice 16-inch OLED display that has 120 Hz NVRR. Yeah, it's easy to recommend these devices if you were in the market for just a general laptop, right? 100% I can get behind these. Now, the HX3070 model is around $1,600 or $1,700, depending on where you're going to be able to find it. The 365 version has less RAM with 24 gigs of RAM and has a chunkier power brick. Yeah, it is like $300-$400 cheaper. Best Buy has an open box offer on this. Like at the moment that I was recording this, it was like $1,100 or $1,200. That's a killer price for this laptop. As it is right now, I get kind of squeamish with kind of recommending these laptops. It's a super premium laptop for everything that they're offering for what the price is right now. If you can wait for these to go on sale, wait for a killer sale because these are fantastic laptops. If you can get a good sale on this, take a look at like slickdeals.com and just keep an ear open. Wait for it to go on sale. Maybe if it hits 1K, 100%. If you can get the HX37 for $1,000, jump on that immediately. That is a killer laptop for that price. So basically that's where I am. If you can get it for like $1,000 or $1,200, I would jump on that immediately. I'm actually upset that I have to return these things. That's where I'm standing right now. Like I wish I could keep one of them, but I have to return both of them, which, whatever, you know, I don't have a lot. I have too much stuff as it is. So I should be thankful that I don't get to keep and hoard stuff. I mean, I've used this. My wife was actually eyeing this up. And I was like, no, I got to send it back. And she's like, oh, that's not good. She said it in other words, but I'll just leave it at that. The last thing I'm going to leave you off with here, and I've repeated this multiple times, is there's no real reason to go over the standard power config on here. It defaults to the standard one, so you don't really have to do anything. If you just have it and open up and use it, that's what it's automatically going to default to anyway, so there's nothing to do there. If you want to go and push it to high performance mode, I would really recommend only doing that when plugged in and using external peripherals and an external monitor. When you need more performance, because in gaming, you're really not going to get much like I already showed you. And even on CPU-wise, there's going to be diminishing returns there as well. So you're only going to be doing that when you actually need to get those last 10, 15% out of the device. And it's going to make the device really hot. So I would really caution you to not go to high performance mode by default. Just leave it at the standard. And that's a general tip that I would say to use for this laptop. It's also going to greatly increase battery life. Thank you very much to my YouTube channel members as well as my Patreon members. Your support really does mean the world to me. I hope this video was informative. As always, guys, thank you for your time, and thanks for watching.